Little Rock is often best remembered, and its role in the civil rights movement is often best remembered, of course, with the Little Rock Nine. In that regard, it's not unique. Topeka in Kansas is synonymous with, Brown versus Board. So often these become shorthand for these cities' roles and their positions and how the civil rights movement impacted them and how they impacted the civil rights movement. But I can't really speak a great deal about Topeka. I don't have a great deal of knowledge about the impact of segregation in detail on that city, but I can speak a little bit about Little Rock. Little Rock's experience with segregation was different than other southern cities because Little Rock in the state of Arkansas was the only southern state, and I'm using southern in the sense that defines southern as including the states that had attempted to secede from the Union, but the only, shall we say, attempted Confederate state that did not have a law that explicitly mandated neighborhoods be segregated by race. So as a result, the situation in Little Rock throughout the time period in which segregation was legal was of a different nature than it might be experienced in, say, New Orleans or Memphis or Richmond or Montgomery or any number of other southern cities. To that extent, it meant that there was a greater proximity, I would say, between the communities of color and the white community here in the city of Little Rock that allowed for overlap to perhaps a greater degree than might have been the case in other southern states at that time. But I can't provide facts and figures on that, but what basically ended up happening was that Little Rock had a sort of a blended around the edges approach. You had neighborhoods that were majority white. For example, the neighborhood around Little Rock Central High School was predominantly a white middle-class neighborhood. But one of the things that was not and is not common knowledge is the fact that one of the streets, which is called Jones Street, which runs right next to Quigley Stadium, which is where the Little Rock Central High School Tigers play football, is that the families that lived on that street, south of 16th Street, were black working class families. So even though the area immediately around Central High School and much of the public viewshed was white, you still had black families that lived in very close proximity to this high school. In fact, it was very much the case that most of the nine had walked by or driven by Little Rock Central High School on a regular basis. Elizabeth Eckford, for example, she and her sister were dropped off at a black church that was in one of the nearby neighborhoods by their parents. After the church service on Sundays, their parents would go home and leave their kids there to hear the Sunday Bible study. They also left their kids with some money for bus fare, but it was often the case that Elizabeth and her sister would simply decide that they wanted to buy donuts from the local corner store instead with that bus fare money, and they just walked home. So Elizabeth was a great example of how, as a result, she walked through the neighborhood in which she would later become immortalized for her walk by Central hundreds of times before that one specific day, September 4th, 1957. So, at least, I suppose the point I'm making here is just, this is a background that many people in the black community here in the city, they knew a great deal about. This was not as cut off from them, perhaps, as it might have been in other cities. It was still inaccessible, but it was not something that they did not have the opportunity to themselves see and perceive and experience in their own ways before what would take place here in 1957. As for the importance of Little Rock in the civil rights movement as a whole, obviously 1957, but the civil rights movement as a whole was scattered geographically throughout the South in a very erratic loop. Because when the law of Brown versus Board was handed down, there was no law that said how this decision was to be interpreted and to be implemented. because the legislative branch, which had that authority, did not act upon the Supreme Court's decision to create a legal framework that states and cities and other places had to reference to follow with desegregation. They did not do that because there was a large pro-segregation element in Congress that pretty much stonewalled those efforts. As a result, it would fall upon individuals and organizations to mobilize and to seek their rights throughout large parts of America on a sort of scattershot basis. So as a result, the story of the civil rights movement starts in many people's minds in Topeka, but then you've got this dogleg down to the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama in 1955, and then you have the integration of Little Rock Central High School in 1957. That's a pretty big whiplash between those places. But as a result, what basically would end up happening is that there were a number of communities that would integrate, and the town next door would not integrate for many years after that. So you had a sort of case-by-case situation that unfolded. Little Rock fell, as I suggested, very shortly after Montgomery's bus boycott, and also shortly after Emmett Till's brutal murder. It was sort of the next linchpin along the line of a long series of plays that would eventually result in the March on Selma, the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act. So as a result, it was one of the early precursors that helped set the stage for that. So the Nine were very much aware of what had happened in Montgomery. They drew inspiration from that. The NAACP drew inspiration from that. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself actually was in attendance cheering on Ernest Green when he graduated. So there is a great deal of overlap in that sense. The communities that are organizing to promote integration are very aware of the successes that have come to pass in other places and are drawing very heavily upon them and looking to them quite earnestly. In the years that would follow, other communities would turn their attention to what had happened here in Little Rock as well, and draw on that as an example and a model of how to mobilize and fight for their rights. And one of the things that kind of speaks to the role Little Rock would continue to play in integration in the years that would come to pass is the fact that Miss Daisy Gadsden Bates, the head of the Arkansas chapter of the NAACP, the mentor to many of the Nine who had opened up her home for them as a place to relax before and after school, and as a place to do homework, and just as a place to unwind after brutal days of harassment and violence directed at these teenagers, would become the only woman who would actually be scheduled to speak at the March on Washington in 1963. So the very same place where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech, Miss Bates was also present and speaking as well. And although she was not the only woman present who did speak, she was the only one scheduled to give remarks. So the role that she played in helping to break the back of the segregationist movement here in the city of Little Rock was something that many people took note of and continued to want to hear talked about, even 6 years after the events that had transpired here in Little Rock. So obviously there's a great degree of interplay between all of these stories, and it doesn't necessarily always make sense when you look at it on a map today to see this whiplash between places, but as a social movement that was often taking on issues on an individual level in many different places all at once. Once you realize that all of this was happening as a sort of web rather than a linear series of events, you begin to see that this was all happening in a sort of not isolation, but greater network, so to speak.